Welcome to Desert Wanderers, produced by Salt and Light Radio. If you're new here, we bridge the gap between you and the person in the pew next to you. We have something new for you for the next couple of weeks with Dr. David Lamey. He is going to be producing a series of talks that will discuss the intersection of science and faith. He'll go over questions of the origin of the universe and genetic code and what God has to do with all of that. With this being said, if you've ever pondered the mysteries of life itself or the origin of the universe, go ahead and stay tuned for this episode. We hope you like it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Lamey, a physician in Boise, Idaho, and self-admitted science nerd. And this is the fourth talk I put together on the intersection of science and faith. Today, I'd like to focus on biology, with the majority of this talk being on DNA and the genetic code and the very important concept of information that is involved in all living organisms. I'll also spend a little bit of time explaining what science knows and doesn't know about the origin of life on Earth and the theory of evolution, and of course how all of this may intersect with faith. Now, in the first half of the 20th century, scientists often looked at living organisms and non-living things in a similar fashion. We felt that everything could ultimately be explained by breaking it down to its matter and energy. But in the latter half of the 20th century, we realized that there's a third component to living organisms, and that is this concept of information. To, I think, fully comprehend the significance of the information in life, I probably need to give a little basic biology lesson, particularly for those who don't have much background in biology, but I'll keep this fairly simple. The basic unit of life, of course, is the cell. And you can think of a cell as a little automated factory. In humans, we have 30 to 35 trillion cells in our bodies. And every one of those cells, with the exception of our red blood cells, every one of those cells has a complete copy of our DNA and all the information packed in there. Now, there are four basic categories of what we call organic molecules, the molecules of life. And this would include proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Now, thinking again as a cell, comparing it to a little automated factory, the basic role of these organic molecules would be the lipids or fats create the structure of the factory. They create the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and the interior walls to create different compartments inside the factory. The carbohydrates provide the energy source to power everything that occurs. The proteins, which are made up of amino acids, they are the tools or the machines doing all of the work inside the factory. And then the DNA and the RNA, the nucleic acids, this is really the computer and software system that directs virtually everything that goes on there, coordinates what goes on inside the cell, and communicates from its nucleus, central compartment, out to other parts in the cell, coordinating things and making things happen. Our DNA is all contained in the separate compartment called a nucleus, and all the DNA is packed into these structures called chromosomes. You can think of a chromosome kind of like a large file cabinet. Now, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 total, and we get half from our mother and half from our father. When a cell is getting ready to divide, the DNA inside the nucleus bunches up and can be seen under a microscope. And all of these chromosomes at that time take the shape of an X. The exception to that is on the 23rd pair of chromosomes, where when both chromosomes take the shape of an X, that indicates a female. But in human males, one of those two chromosomes is much smaller and takes the shape of a Y. And an interesting fact is, because of this smaller Y-shaped chromosome, human males actually have 1.8% less overall DNA than human females do. And I like to joke that maybe that explains a thing or two. But in any event, if we take apart one chromosome, what we're going to find is the DNA is really just a long string. It's a long string made up of alternating phosphate and sugar molecules. The sugar molecules in DNA are called deoxyribose, and in RNA they're called ribose. But it's really just a long, long string of alternating sugar phosphate molecules. Off the side of this long string are side chains called nucleotide bases, and there are 4 of these. You don't need to remember their names, but their names are adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thiamine. So we identify each one of these bases by the first letter, and therefore we talk about the A's, G's, C's, and T's lined up along the string, and it's these nucleobases that are the information or the code in our genetic code. If you were to take the DNA out of just one of your cells and line it end to end, it would stretch out to 6 feet. And the number of these nucleobases in each one of our cells is about 3.2 billion. So that's quite a bit of information in there. Now, I want to turn to proteins for just a second so you can start to really see this communication information function of our DNA. Proteins, as I said, are the tools or the machines doing all the work inside our cells. And proteins are made up of what are called amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids in human proteins. And as proteins are made, they're made also as a long string, one amino acid after another in a string. Once a protein is formed, that string of amino acids folds up on itself, and it takes a very specific three-dimensional shape. And it's the three-dimensional shape of the protein that really determines its function, its role. Much like the tools in your tool chest all do their job based on their shape, the exact same thing is true with proteins. And if you get one or more of those amino acids in the wrong place, there's a tendency for that protein to fold in the wrong way, and if it folds in the wrong way, it likely does not do its job. In humans, there are about 20,000 genes that code for the construction of proteins, and the average number of amino acids per protein is around 400. How this all works is when we need to build a new protein, the DNA inside the nucleus makes a copy of itself in a strand of RNA. That RNA leaves the nucleus, goes out into another part in the cell where the protein gets built. And a section of 3 of those A's, G's, C's, and T's, a section of 3 is called a codon, and a codon codes for one amino acid. So a genetic mutation is a change in one of those letters. If you start changing those letters, you'll get different amino acids in the construction of your protein. The structure of our DNA was figured out by 2 scientists named Watson and Crick in 1953. And it wasn't long after that, in the 50s and 60s, that this whole protein construction mechanism was figured out. Now, there are 3.2 billion of the A's, G's, C's, and T's in our DNA. And the part that codes for proteins only makes up about 1.5% of that total DNA. So for a long time, scientists weren't sure what the rest of it was doing. In fact, many scientists thought it was essentially junk just left over from the evolutionary process. But we've learned more and more, particularly beginning with what's called the ENCODE project. This is a multi-center study, began in 2003, and it began after the human genome was mapped. But at that point, scientists began studying all the rest of this DNA, trying to figure out what it was doing. And we now know that the vast majority of it doesn't code for proteins, but in fact has regulatory functions within our cells, telling things when to turn off, when to turn on, go repair this, let's get ready to divide. All the different coordination and regulation activities of our cells is along much of that DNA. And the ENCODE project has now told us that probably 80% of our DNA is functional, and over time that number may approach 100%. Bill Gates, who knows a thing or two about software, has said, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. So where did the information in life come from? You have to explain both the information in the first living organisms on the planet, plus the new information that was necessary for more complicated organisms to exist. So far, scientists really don't have a good, plausible explanation for this. The first theory that people had was perhaps it happened by random chance. Now, no one takes this seriously any longer. If you think about even a relatively small protein of, say, 100 amino acids, that's going to take 300 nucleobases in order to code for it. And the chance of those lining up in just the right order by random chance is virtually impossible. Secondly, people thought that perhaps there's a chemical reason to explain how they lined up along the DNA molecule. But we now know that's not possible. We know that along that string of phosphate sugar molecules, any of those 4 nucleobases has an equal chemical affinity to lining up on that string. Plus, the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry give us predictable and repeating patterns that we can observe. And so if the laws of chemistry were responsible for how things lined up, that would give us a string of letters that was predictable and repeating. And this is clearly not what you want if you're trying to create a code of information. Then there was a thought that perhaps some type of a Darwinian mechanism would account for it. But we now know that's not possible. This is a huge chicken and egg problem. For DNA to reproduce itself where natural selection might act on it and pick what works and throw out what doesn't work, the DNA has to be able to reproduce itself. But for it to reproduce itself, it needs to be in an organism that has a whole bunch of proteins already existing just so that organism can survive and reproduce. So, which do you explain first? It's a chicken and egg problem. This led to something called the RNA World Hypothesis, and some scientists thought that perhaps RNA came before proteins or before DNA. And the reason this became interesting to many scientists was because in the lab, you can have some spontaneous formation of nucleic acids lining up and forming a short string of RNA. And then if there are other nucleotides in the area, you will sometimes get a copy of that RNA. So this led people to start thinking perhaps that led to some process where a Darwinian mechanism could occur. But it's really not considered a legitimate possibility by most scientists any longer, for several reasons. One is that RNA itself is inherently very unstable. Once it's created, it breaks down quite quickly, and that's opposite of DNA, which is inherently much more stable. And secondly, you would have to get a string of RNA long enough to have some meaningful information in it, and we still have the problems of how would random chance do that. So the bottom line is, although a lot of research has been done to try to explain where that information in life came from, thus far science is really at a loss to explain it. Let's dive a bit deeper into this whole concept of information. Now, obviously, everybody in their mind kind of knows what information is. But Webster's dictionary defines it in a couple of ways. The first is the communication or reception of knowledge or intelligence. The communication or reception of knowledge or intelligence. That's easy to understand. The second, a little bit harder to understand, but this is the one that really pertains to the information stored in biology. The attribute inherent in and communicated by alternate sequences or arrangements of something that produce specific effects. Kind of a mouthful, but let me explain. The second definition here we can term functional information. It's information that is doing something. It's not just a set of raw data, but it's communicated, and whoever or whatever receives that communication, it's creating an effect in that device or that person. Let's look at some examples. I'm speaking English as we're talking here, hopefully reasonably understandable English, but I'm speaking English that has a set defined grammar and syntax associated with this. And as long as whoever hears what I'm saying knows the grammar and syntax, then as the sound that my mouth is making gets your ear and enters your brain, I'm communicating information, functional information, because functional information will have meaning or a message or an instruction. Now, my mouth could be making all kinds of sounds that hit your ear and don't create any meaning, message, or instruction, and that wouldn't be functional information. The same thing, of course, is true with any written text. As long as you know the grammar and the syntax and the rules of the written text, you'll be able to read written text and there'll be functional information there. A sheet of music provides functional information to a musician in order to play a particular piece of music. Radio waves generated by a radio station are electromagnetic energy passing through the air, and when they hit the transistor radio, it causes that radio to produce music or to produce talk or something, and those radio waves in the air are functional information. They're producing an effect that has meaning, message, or an instruction. We live in what we call the information age, the computer age. All of the software that exists in our computers and in all of our devices is functional information that is communicated downstream to some type of a hardware device where it creates an effect. What we know about all of these, and really any example we can come up with of functional information that causes an effect downstream to whatever receives that information and provides meaning, a message, or instruction, all functional information that we know of comes from a mind or an intelligence. This has obvious theistic implications. Now, this is not a God of the gaps argument. For those of you who don't know, a God of the gaps argument is simply science has not yet explained X, therefore God must have done X. I discourage people from using God of the gaps argument because even if you're open-minded, it gives the appearance that you're actually closed-minded to further scientific knowledge or further scientific investigation. I don't think it's intellectually dishonest to make a God of the gaps argument, because if you're a believer in God, then you believe that if you chase back the chain of events, chain of cause and effect far enough, everything points to God in the beginning. But the reason I say there's a theistic implication here is because of a type of reasoning known as inference to the best explanation. And this type of reasoning has to be done in anything we call historical science. So science you can kind of divide into two categories, operational science and historical science. Operational science explains things that are ongoing, and we can come up with laws in physics and chemistry to explain these things and make predictions about what's going to happen with these things in the future. Examples would include things like the orbit of the Earth around the sun can be explained by laws of gravity and momentum, and the alignment of sodium and chloride molecules together and how they structure themselves into salt can be perfectly explained by the laws of chemistry. But historical science tries to give an explanation for things that aren't repeating, that have only occurred one time in history. And these would be things like, how did the Earth form? Why did the dinosaurs go extinct? How did life first arise on our planet? In any of these historical sciences, we use science to gather as much empiric data as possible. But science will never be able to conclusively prove the explanation for these one-time occurrences. We take the science as far as it will take us, and then we have to use some type of logic and reasoning, and here we use inference to the best explanation. So when I argue that inference to the best explanation tells us that the functional information in living organisms is best explained by an intelligence, does that necessarily mean a transcendent intelligence like God? Well, there are plenty of people who have proposed and believed that life on this planet was seeded by extraterrestrial life. This theory is called panspermia. And there's a lot of intelligent people that are strongly considering this, but there is a catch. The catch is, we know, not we believe, but we know that the universe began to expand from a very hot, dense state about 13.8 billion years ago. We talked about this in the last talk. We don't know for certain that the universe came out of absolutely nothing at all, although the science seems to indicate that. But we do know for certain it was a very hot, dense state that began expanding rapidly a long time ago. And in that hot, dense state, there's no chance that life could have existed. So if you want to propose panspermia as the reason for life on this planet, you still have to give an explanation for how the functional information originated in the extraterrestrial organisms that would have brought life here. Okay, let's now spend a little bit of time talking about origin of life and then about evolution. When Darwin proposed his theory of evolution in 1859, he did not propose any explanation for the first life on Earth. His theory started with cells and went up to the complex life forms we see today. But in his defense, scientists in the middle of the 19th century thought that cells were actually pretty simple structures. Much like sodium and chloride, if you put them together, will always react and form salt. Scientists thought that if you simply put some organic molecules and a few electrolytes together, there would be a chemical reaction and life could spontaneously begin in a relatively easy way. Now, I know everybody's heard these buzzwords in science like the primordial soup in ponds or hydrothermal vents deep under the ocean where life began. But we still have to be able to explain the actual science, the actual chemistry, and how we went from non-living chemicals to life. And remember, when we envision a primordial soup or a pond, we right now have an image of a pond on Earth, and any pond we look at on Earth right now is teeming full of life. Picture the Earth as it was 4 billion years ago, when any of the dry land was just crusted lava, and any of the water that existed was completely sterile. By definition, sterility means no living organisms. So the image of any pond back then is quite different than the image of ponds we have in our mind today. But nevertheless, people began wondering, how did life begin? And in studying that, they realized that the cell is more complicated than they thought in the middle of the 19th century. Well, ultimately, a biologist from Russia named Alexander Oparin came up with a theory that many people thought might be true. What he said was, the organic molecules that we talked about earlier are made up essentially of 6 different atoms. The main 4 are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And then there's also some phosphorus and sulfur. Well, Oparin said perhaps simple chemistry combines these atoms into small molecules. And then over time, chemical reactions will take these small molecules and ultimately create the organic molecules that we've already talked about. Then if these organic molecules somehow organize, we might get some reactions and some early metabolism occurring between them, and eventually this leads to a living organism. There was an experiment done in 1953 that seemed to give some evidence for this theory. This is the famous Miller-Urey experiment, and the Miller-Urey experiment still appears in all the biology textbooks in high school and college. And what these 2 scientists did is they took 4 gases. They took water, hydrogen, ammonia, and methane, and they heated them up and then sparked them to simulate an electrical charge, a lightning strike. And in doing this, they were able to create some organic molecules, including a few amino acids. And suddenly people got excited, saying, look, science is beginning to explain how this all occurred. Well, that experiment, although still widely reported in biology textbooks, most scientists now believe that the conditions they presupposed in the early Earth's atmosphere really were not correct. But it almost doesn't really matter, because at least in laboratories, scientists have been able to build organic molecules if they follow very precise recipes and techniques. But even if the various organic molecules could have somehow spontaneously formed in the early atmosphere, it doesn't really get us close to life. You could have a complete pile of the various organic molecules, and that doesn't get you to life any easier than having a big pile of Scrabble letters gets you to the novel Moby Dick. Scientists know this. They know that if they take a living cell and use a small needle to pop it and tear it apart and separate the components of the cell, you now have all of the organic molecules you need in just the right concentrations. And the chance of that somehow spontaneously reassembling it into life is 0. And currently, the chance that a scientist could somehow manipulate that and create life is also 0. Now, it certainly may be possible in the future that a scientist could do something with enough organic molecules, manipulating them perhaps to create life. We don't know. But even if in the future that becomes possible, that is certainly not simulating a random process occurring to create life. That is simulating intelligence creating life. The absolutely fascinating thing about all of the research going into the origin of life question is the more it's looked at, the harder it seems to be to explain. The more we learn about it, the further we seem to have an explanation for it. The scientists say it's like someone's moving the goalpost away all the time. So that's not what normally happens in science. Normally what happens in science is the more you investigate something, the closer you get to figuring out what's going on. Okay, let's spend the last few minutes talking about evolution. Evolution actually means several things. The first meaning is that life on Earth changes over time, and of course there's no dispute about that. There was simple one-celled organisms on this planet about 3.8 billion years ago. Today we have an immense variety of plants and animals. And over that time, many plants and animals live that no longer live. So life certainly does change over time. The second definition has to do with a particular organism or a particular species changing some of its characteristics over time. And there's really no dispute over that. Now, Darwin didn't propose that or discover that. That's been known for probably 12,000 years, since human beings stopped living a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle and began raising crops and domesticating animals. We've known that depending on how you mate your animals or cross your plants, we can create some changes within that species. The best example we all have of that today are domesticated dogs. When you look at all the various sizes, shapes, colors, behaviors, these are all the same organism. They're all the same species, Canis lupus. And in fact, wolves are too. And we know that domesticated dogs came from wolves thousands and thousands of years ago. This type of evolution of a particular species changing some of its characteristics is now known as microevolution. Well, Darwin took this knowledge of microevolution and proposed that if we give this enough time, it will eventually lead to completely different species with different body plans and different body parts. His theory really involves two things. The first is called common descent, and this is the theory that all life on Earth originates from a common ancestor billions of years ago, and that these slow changes have led to all the plants and animals that exist today. And the second part of his theory is really the mechanism for how that occurred, and that is called natural selection on random variation. That is when plants or animals have offspring, those offspring are usually not identical. There's usually some variability in the offspring. And certain traits that those offspring have may give them a survival advantage in whatever environment they're living in. And in this way, Darwin believed that that would lead to the gradual evolutionary changes that occur over time. That's also called survival of the fittest. Darwin knew nothing about DNA or the genetic code. That came almost 100 years after Darwin's theory. So biologists today include what we know about the genetic code. And Darwin's original theory has been modified slightly, and today we call it neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is that natural selection acts on random genetic mutations. The changing of those A's, G's, C's, and T's creates something slightly different in the organism, and the natural selection acts on that. That type of evolution is now being called macroevolution. Now, there's widespread belief among most people in society that Darwinism, or what we call now neo-Darwinism, is proven, that it's really beyond any dispute. And in fact, even among most people working in science or people teaching biology, most of these people even have the opinion that Darwinism is absolutely true and beyond dispute. But when you ask people in the field of evolution, evolutionary biologists, you'll find that there's widespread doubt and skepticism about the neo-Darwinian mechanism being capable of creating the very profound changes that are necessary to create entirely new organisms. There's so much skepticism among evolutionary biologists that it's led to a whole new movement in evolutionary biology called the Third Way. You can actually go to a website called thethirdwayofevolution.com to read about this a little bit. The reasons that these evolutionary biologists are becoming so skeptical are many. I'll go over just three quick ones. The first is that Darwin himself said that if transitional forms going from one type of organism to another, this should occur through very gradual successive changes, and that the fossil record should have lots of these organisms that show how this transition occurred. Well, we're now 165 years after Darwin proposed his theory, and the fossil record is much, much larger. And in fact, these transitional forms have not been found. What we have found is ample evidence of microevolution occurring, but finding anything that really shows us how one type of animal evolved into a completely different body plan, that's drastically lacking. There are a couple of examples that I won't have time to go into right now, but even those examples, when most paleontologists look at them, they go, that's not it. There's big problems with those examples. But the examples shouldn't be few anyways. The fossil record should be chock full of all kinds of these fossil records showing these transitional species. The second problem is at various points in history, life has rapidly changed. And the best example of this is known as the Cambrian explosion. This is sometimes called the Big Bang of evolution, life's Big Bang. What happened about 530 million years ago is over the course of just 5 to 10 million years, we went from very simple organisms in the ocean to a huge variety of very complicated plants and animals with all different kinds of body plans. And there's really no way to understand how that could occur in such a short time in history with Darwin's mechanism of gradual changes occurring. Now, Darwin was actually aware of that and realized it was a problem for his theory, but he thought that ultimately there would be some explanation for that, and there still is not. But the biggest reason, I think the thing that has convinced most people to look for something other than Darwin's theory to explain macroevolution, is really mathematics. When we began to understand the protein construction that we talked about earlier, mathematicians would look at that and go and think, well, if we start changing these A's, G's, C's, and T's, now we change the amino acids, now that protein folds differently, and the odds seem a lot more likely that that change, that mutation, is going to create something that doesn't work at all, not something that does something new or works better. Now, this was theoretical, but it seemed fairly apparent to many mathematicians. Now, there has been some very good laboratory experiments done that prove this. In fact, probably some of the best work was by a scientist named Douglas Axe, who was working at Cambridge on bacteria causing these mutations and seeing how likely it was that something could lead to something useful and functional versus something detrimental to the organism. This is something that's actually intuitive to computer scientists or software engineers. They know that if they take their software and start randomly changing some of the ones and zeros in their software, they know that their software program is going to deteriorate and ultimately crash and not function. And if you told them that you could randomly make some changes to their software and suddenly have something that does a new program and does something better and different than the last one did, they'd find that laughable. It's not to say that mutations don't do some things for organisms. Probably one of the best examples is in bacteria, where certain genetic mutations can create an antibiotic resistance. But again, this is nothing more than an example of microevolution. It doesn't get us to macroevolution. Now, I brought up these two things, the uncertainty about the origin of life and the uncertainty about macroevolution, not to make a God of the Gaps argument. I brought them up because the widespread belief in society that science has explained the origin of life and has explained the origin of all the different life forms that exist today. Those beliefs, mistaken beliefs, have led more people than anything else in science to question the reality of God's existence. If we are the product of matter and energy and the forces of physics and chemistry acting on that to create the first life, and then the product of a gradual, unguided evolutionary process that created us. We're just a cosmic accident, the product of a long, natural, unguided process. I think it's important for people to actually know what science is telling us, but I think it's equally important for them to know what science is not yet telling us. All right, I'll conclude there. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention today. My take-home 3 points are: there is functional information in all of life, and there was from the very beginning, and the very best explanation for this, in fact, the only explanation at this point, seems to be intelligence. That the origin of life is completely uncertain, and the more we examine it, the further we seem to be from explaining it. And how macroevolution has occurred is very controversial and uncertain among evolutionary biologists. I hope you found this interesting and probably thought-provoking. I look forward to further discussions ahead on the intersection of science and faith. Have a nice day.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Desert Wanderers. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up as well as subscribe down below. We're produced by Salt and Light Radio, so you can find us on social platforms at Salt and Light Radio or Desert Wanderers Podcast. We produce episodes every week and we launch them for you on Wednesdays. So make sure to tune in for next week's episode and we'll see you then.